illegal in Canada. Additionally, as we saw earlier, the total number of women what have been classified as honor killings are so low when compared to other incidences of violence against women. According to Thomas Walcom, Bill S7 would rewrite the criminal code to preclude a defendant in a murder trial from arguing that an insult to family honor provoked his action. Such a clause might be necessary if Canada's courts were routinely soft on honor killers, but they aren't. As such, this bill is unnecessary, and it has been passed to simply spread the fear of Muslim immigrants in Canada. In the guise of protecting women, it takes pot shots at Muslim immigrants. Its motives are crassly political. Moreover, it's important to note that the use of the words barbaric cultural practices suggests that so-called Eastern practices of violence are backwards and unacceptable, unlike Western violence. The words zero tolerance suggests that honor violence and other barbaric practices are a real threat to Canadian society, and that the nation-state fortifies itself by not tolerating these practices. It presents the Canadian state as unified and strong on this front. Therefore, through the use of particular language, the Canadian government is effectively reproducing a white state through fear-mongering, which leads to the casting out of Muslims in Canada. And so FGM is falsely associated with Islam, even by reputable international organizations. Condemning FGM is used as a tool to vilify Islam and, by extension, all peoples from the Middle East and South Asia, as they're conflated as being one and the same. This logic is used to condemn Muslim immigrants in Canada by presenting them as barbaric and not having quote-unquote Canadian values, whatever that means, which also contributes to the exceptionalism of Muslims in Canada. Canada has been a white nation since its inception. Colonial nationalism of settler countries was based on a sense of ideal citizenship that was inclusionist in its populism, while being exclusionist in its relation to Indigenous peoples and all those immigrants racialized as not white. The evicting of racialized peoples produces white nations and preserves whiteness as the norm. Therefore, the Muslim exceptionalism and the discourses of barbaric backwards peoples actually serve to reproduce the whiteness of the nation-state through the processes of exceptionalism and creating camps where the rule of law ceases to apply for racialized peoples. These Islamophobic discourses also affect ideologies regarding immigration policies, as racist discourses about honor killing and FGM also serve to curb immigration in Canada. Muslims, especially women, are portrayed to be unassimilable. Understanding how these discourses serve to curb immigration is extremely important. Honor violence must be treated as a form of domestic violence that cuts across all cultures. However, this is not possible because of our normalized narrative of who is human and who is entitled to human rights. Sylvia Winter argues that one cannot unsettle the coloniality of power without a redescription of the human outside the terms of our present descriptive statement of the human. This binary portrays immigrants are determined by their culture, while Canadians have laws and values that are rooted in legal institutions, because white people have been constructed as secular subjects. As Winter argues, we must challenge and redefine what it means to be human, because it is against these white normative understandings of the human against which Canada views Muslims. Additionally, the political work of vilifying Muslims through the condemnation of honor killings and FGM will not simply disappear. Thus, a new story about the human needs to be told, because the current definition has created a world in which the nation-state's torture and murder of Muslim bodies is warranted, nay, encouraged. It is the world where Muslim peoples all over the world are demanded to publicly state, as a Muslim, I condemn this attack and terrorism in any form, in order to secure their acceptance and security. Anyone with brown skin is subject to victimization. In this world, governments colonize, murder, rape, and pillage Muslim communities under the discourse of feminism. Yet, Muslims are the ones who are painted as barbaric, irrational, and inhuman. Moving forward, many activists demand that Canada must inquire into how it can include Muslim bodies into the nation-state and how Canadians can better approach conversations about honor killing and FGM. Activists and scholars also demand how we can end institutionalized Islamophobia and the exceptionalism of Muslim bodies. However, these are the wrong questions to ask, because the root of the problem lies in our understanding of the human. We can't argue for assimilation because that's predicated on exclusion. Canadians cannot seek to include Muslim peoples into national belonging, because national belonging is predicated upon further marginalization of Indigenous peoples. Canadian citizenship remains predicated upon the erasure of Aboriginal sovereignty. And unless this institution can be transformed in relation to the realization of Aboriginal sovereignty, it will remain as an instrument of colonial dispossession. The Canadian state is founded on exclusion. Thus, it is a paradox for everyone to belong in the Canadian state. This institution of settler citizenship in Canada will never recognize Indigenous sovereignty unless Indigenous peoples are considered as human. And so the questions we need to pose are, how can we reclassify our understanding of the human? Who gets to define what the limits of tolerance are? Can we ethically redefine the human without homogenizing or disregarding the experiences and histories of racialized bodies? Who should be involved in this dialogue? Marginalized peoples across the board experience interrelated oppression, which is why we all need to work together in order to achieve better futures. We need to deconstruct processes of exaltation. And only then will we be able to effectively address the exclusion of Muslim bodies within the Canadian state. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least is Jasmine Zine. Jasmine Zine is a professor of sociology and the Muslim studies option at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has numerous journal articles, and she has at least a couple of books and a co-edited volume. The books are Canadian Islamic Schools Unraveling the Politics of Faith, Gender, Knowledge and Identity, and the First Ethnography of Islamic Schooling in North America, and in Islam in the Hinterland, Muslim Cultural Politics in Canada. Her co-edited volume is entitled Muslim Women, Transnational Feminism and the Ethics of Pedagogy, Contested Imaginaries in Post-9/11 Cultural Practices. She has worked with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada, where she conducted a national study. She has award-winning curriculum. She has worked with several organizations, including UNESCO, United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organizations. The paper of Jasmine Zine is entitled Muslim Women, Gendered Islamophobia, the Fashioning of Sartorial Nationalism in Canada. Jasmine.
My son is watching and is mortified by my technological incompetence. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I am cognizant of being the last speaker on the last panel of today, and so thanks to everyone for hanging in. My presentation, I want to discuss how issues of veiling, and in particular the highly contested face veil or niqab, have become major flashpoints in Muslim cultural politics in Canada, especially in the last federal election, which took place in the fall. In 2010, the province of Quebec, there was legislation proposed to prevent women who wear the face veil from accessing government services and public institutions. At the federal level, the former Conservative government implemented a ban on the niqab during citizenship ceremonies. These moves cost the government about $500,000. Both policies have been recently overturned, but the public debate surrounding them have been instructive in the way that it reveals how gendered Islamophobia operates in the Canadian imaginary. It's through such policies that citizenship and national belonging has been being determined sartorially, as the nation is configured through the kinds of dress that signify belonging and allegiance to dominant values. Such moves are rationalized through discourses of fear and moral panic, galvanized by the war on terror, where women's bodies have become an ideological battleground. Veiling debates signal a broader attempt to decide the legitimate cultural, and in this case sartorial, representations of the nation and who has a right to belong to it. I would further argue that the preoccupation with unveiling Muslim women's bodies continues the colonial and orientalist fascination with their bodies. Muslim women are regarded as through a mixture of this imperialist fascination and humanist pity. and their bodies have become a site where the rehabilitative influences of Western cultural norms must be inscribed. As Zoya was pointing out, one example of this is the policy in Canada, the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which became law last year as an amendment to the Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act. And while it deals with the issues of polygamy, forced marriage, and so on, it tells us, the naming itself tells us more about the underlying message. Connected to this policy was a suggested tip line for barbaric cultural practices, which was suggested by the former Minister of Status of Women, so that you could phone in a tip, you know, if you heard something about FGM or honor killing or were suspicious of your neighbors. Fortunately, that didn't take place because that government did not get elected. And interestingly, that minister has now sort of backtracked and said she regrets actually making that suggestion in the first place. However, some might consider those crocodile tears too little too late when the damage has already been done. So the other issue I think that's interesting about the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act is that it always seems to signify Muslims. There's a way in which Muslim bodies get interpolated into this discourse of barbarity, these sort of colonial tropes, ways to sort out the savage and the civilized. And without actually mentioning Muslims, it becomes self-referential in the way that ideas of barbarity and cultural degeneracy are linked to Muslim bodies. So Muslims represent the anti-citizen and bring along with them a form of civilizational danger that threatens the white secular state and requires cultural reform and rehabilitation through liberalism and paternal state regulation. This is a kind of what I call disciplinary multiculturalism, where minoritized groups who are deemed as transgressive and illiberal must be disciplined back into the grid of multicultural conformity. Thinking through, for example, the famous argument by Susan Mahler-Oken on is multiculturalism bad for women? This idea that we are sacrificing women's rights on the altar of multiculturalism. So this, narrative has been pervasive in many ways, running through the way Canadian policy has been shaped. So for the recalcitrant Niqabi women unwilling to assimilate, their acquiescence is being brought about by outright coercion from the state. What is often not highlighted in the debates about banning veils is the corporeal, spiritual, and political violence this move enacts. And it's evident that in the clear absence of sound social or political reasoning that the legislation is being built on campaigns of racial and religious demonization, and obviously are leading to further xenophobia and backlash against Muslims. And yet there's little to warrant such overblown concern. According to the Muslim Council of Montreal, there are presumed to be about 25 women in all of Quebec who actually wear the niqab. And out of approximately 120 people who access Montreal's health and health services, 2008 to 2009, only 10 actually asked for any form of accommodation and did not ask for any kind of special treatment. Yet, a 2015 poll showed that 80% of Quebecers believe the niqab should be banned in government offices and courts. However, the same poll showed that 61% of Quebecers had rarely or never seen a woman wearing a niqab. So it's interesting the way in which this signifies danger, I would argue a form of civilizational danger that doesn't actually require the bodies there to justify that particular fear. Now, there was vocal opposition from Muslim groups and broader social justice organizations. Amnesty International warned that the ban would violate the rights of freedom of expression of religion of those women who choose to express their identity or beliefs in this way. Broad coalitions of Muslim groups, secular women's organizations, student associations, anti-racist and social justice organizations galvanized to contest the legislation as an undue form of state control over women's bodies, which would have effectively trampled on their civil liberties and rights and denied them access to basic necessities of life, such as education, healthcare, and social services, should that proposal have gone through. In fact, the ban also compromised the same liberal rights of women who choose to cover their face with respect to the freedom of expression and religion, and became a matter of necessary collateral damage in a larger battle against the illiberal minorities. Proponents of the ban argued that the niqab symbolizes subjugation of women and therefore contradicts the liberal secular values of Canadian society and should therefore be banned. Yet this move undermines the very liberal values they claim to be championing, under the guise of rescuing Muslim women from their illiberal values, faith, and ultimately their illiberal clothing. This enacts what I call a form of sartorial nationalism, where veiled Muslim women within what Anderson describes as the imagined community of the nation are rendered unimaginable as citizens, and therefore positioned outside of the nation and of political community. Their bodies cannot be coded within the dominant boundaries of national belonging due to their dress that was described by one Quebec politician as an ambulatory prison. Ironically, they are politically and socially outcast at the same time by their style of dress and by the state's attempt to regulate it. In this move, citizenship and national belonging is being determined sartorially, as the nation is circumscribed not only by the dominant cultural values and beliefs that veiling is seen to somehow abrogate, but it's also configured through the same kinds of dress that signify belonging and allegiance to dominant values. The niqab became a sartorial signifier of national exclusion that is seen as a betrayal of dominant liberal values and therefore positions Muslim women as outsiders to the nation and deviants within the law. The role of the state in determining the way Muslim women should dress in order to render themselves docile national subjects who dutifully demonstrate their allegiance to dominant liberal norms through their dress code needs to be challenged for their racism and sexism. Now, there was some, sorry, I'm trying to advance this. Okay. That's, yeah, maybe there's that. So there was a response, thank you, to the way that the Prime Minister was trying to regulate women's dress. So there was some hashtag activism that went on under the hashtag dress code PM or dress code Prime Minister. And where Muslim women and non-Muslim women were posting pictures of themselves and asking the Prime Minister whether their attire was okay. So you see some examples here and examples wearing, hockey jerseys and things like that to sort of really re-describe whether, you can be Canadian. If you like hockey, you must be Canadian. Oh, did it go?
It is going.
Oh.
It is going.
It wasn't going here, that's right, okay. This is another one, again, by some non-Muslim women as well, who are asking questions, asking a premier about whether they're allowed to wear certain beads or their scarves. So you could see the way that this was taken up, sort of tongue-in-cheek, by a lot of women who responded to this. Oh, this was mine. Which dress makes me look the least oppressed? I wouldn't want to lose my Canadian citizenship. Should my ensemble be not quite Canadian enough? I sure hope salmon pink is not too subversive. Okay, so those are just some examples. Again, when we talk about these issues of the way policies are reinforcing particular notions about Muslims and Muslim women in particular, that there is agency and resistance that comes through various forms, both through organizations or through social media in this particular case. So this paternalistic desire to unveil and liberate Muslim women on the part of Western secular states, and echoed by many Western feminists, is articulated through Spivak's famous terms of saving brown women from brown men, and is part of the deeper impetus for rescuing Muslim women from their backward beliefs and attire, and that has been presumably forced upon them by misogynistic Muslim men. Their right to choose as agentic subjects and maintain a sense of bodily integrity is nullified by the state's intervention in deciding for them what lies in their best interest. This authoritarian paternalism of the Canadian state mirrors the religious mandates requiring women to cover that the mullahs of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan use in similar ways to regulate the bodies of Muslim women and deny them the right of how to decide how to express their identity and faith. This put the Canadian government in an ironic position of being the arbiter of Islamic religious doctrine, transforming the then Minister of Citizenship, Jason Kenney, into Mullah Kenney, as the state took it upon itself to not only decide, what religious doctrine was in relation to Islam and what was required and not required in terms of religious clothing. And very similarly to the same kinds of sanctions that are imposed on women to cover in other countries. What's interesting about this whole debate is that the initial proposal for regulating Muslim women's dress was first put forward by a Muslim organization. The impetus for the niqab ban was spearheaded in 2009 by the Muslim Canadian Congress, or the MCC, who appealed to Ottawa to introduce legislation to ban the wearing of masks, niqabs, and the burqa in all public settings. Now, they went on to say in a press statement that the ban is necessary to ensure public safety, since not only is the wearing of a face mask, and I'm quoting here, a security hazard, and it has led to a number of bank heists in Canada and overseas, the burqa and niqab are political symbols of Saudi-inspired Islamic extremism. I don't know, I've not seen these ubiquitous bank heists and things that they're talking about. I do recall the MCC also saying it was a matter of health to actually ban niqab because of vitamin D deficiency. So that was another argument that they had. You know, and we can laugh about these things except for the fact that this particular group and their views became codified into law and practice. So the MCC linked the niqab and burqa to criminality and terrorism, much the same way that other openly Islamophobic neoconservative fearmongers. And again, this shows us that the Muslim community is not monolithic, that there's diverse and competing perspectives. But what's of real concern here is that Muslim organizations are being oriented around neoconservative and xenophobic views, such as those espoused by the MCC. And then again, on the other hand, you have other organizations that come along with more patriarchal, Puritan religious lines. And the situation of Muslim women, therefore, hangs in the balance between the competing frames of reference and ideologies being purveyed by Muslim organizations, both religious and secular, who position themselves as political vanguards for these women. The narrow views of the MCC reflect what's called the Orientalism of Orientals, and the patriarchal and Puritan fundamentalist view purveyed by certain religious sectors of the community place Muslim women in between equally limiting polemics. Both ideological vantage points produce authorizing discourses that leave little space for Muslim women themselves to articulate their sense of agency, womanhood, faith, and citizenship. So while Muslim women are increasingly claiming spaces within Islam and within the national narrative, they're left unsupported by some of the women's groups, such as the Quebec Council for the Status of Women, who instead have taken up a paternalistic mode of feminism in their support of Bill 94 as a means for preserving gender equality, despite the fact that the bill would have only allowed some women the right to choose how to dress, should they want to access health care, education, or social services, and would deny that right to others. In response, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women rightly pointed out that the implications of that bill were short-sighted and in fact highly detrimental to women, pointing out the fact that women would become further isolated and marginalized if they weren't allowed to access and were refused services, and parents, their role of parents would also be restricted if they weren't able to fully participate in society. So again, this idea of the niqab being something that limits women's participation in society was being banned in a way that would actually lead to the exact same outcome. So in conclusion, I want to point out that these discourses are rooted within a culture of fear that has emerged and framed many of the debates regarding Muslim cultural politics since 9/11. Fear makes such rhetoric an easy sell in a climate of increased militarization abroad, including Canada's role in Afghanistan, the ongoing war on terror, and domestic anti-terror legislation and security policies. Fear and moral panic provide the rationale for many of the repressive policies and practices that are easily legitimized by the public out of so-called rational concerns for safety and security, as Muslims have become the new folk devils. And as I've argued before in some of my work, again, Muslim women become positioned precariously between this sort of ideological battleground that their bodies have become, between both imperial and patriarchal politics are played out through Muslim women's bodies. So between this Orientalism and fundamentalism, which is where the Muslim women's identity, faith, and inclusion in the state, in various states, hang in the balance. Thank you.